The United States says that it has seized 2 oil tankers linked to Venezuela. 2 oil tankers also in violation of economic sanctions. U.S. forces boarded the first tanker in the North Atlantic near Iceland after pursuing it for weeks, declaring that it had been seized due to violations of U.S. sanctions. The ship was registered as a Russian vessel. Moscow has denounced the seizure, calling it a violation of international law. The second vessel was seized in the Caribbean. U.S. officials say that both ships are part of a shadow fleet that carries oil from Russia, Iran, and Venezuela in defiance of Western sanctions. All right, for more now, I want to bring in DW's reporter Nick Counter from Riga. Riga is where we carry out our reporting of Russia, since DW has been banned from carrying out its work inside the country. Nick, what has been the official reaction from Moscow to this seizure?
Well, there hasn't been any official statements from key figures in Moscow just yet, because today many Russians are celebrating Christmas. So key figures such as President Vladimir Putin are more preoccupied with broadcasting their holiday festivities. However, according to Russia's state news agency, the foreign ministry did say that they are demanding humane and dignified treatment and a safe and speedy return of all Russian nationals aboard the ship, while the Russian Transport Ministry has accused the United States of violating international law.
And what about the Russian media and military bloggers? How are they reporting on this?
Well, as I mentioned, it's Christmas, so accordingly, the big popular propaganda talk shows that air on Russian TV are not broadcasting tonight and will presumably make their statements tomorrow. As for the military bloggers, however, most are expressing outrage that Russia was unable to stop the seizure by the United States. One blogger wrote that this will convince Trump that Russia can be pushed around. So we can really see that in the aftermath of the United States' attack on Venezuela, pro-government Russians are more worried than ever about Russia's ability to put its words into actions.
All right, our reporter Nick Counter with the latest from Riga. Nick, thank you. But today there were reports of a Russian submarine on its way to escort the tanker that was seized by the United States. I asked DW's Russia analyst Konstantin Eggert if there was ever a risk of a direct military confrontation.
First of all, we have to confirm whether this specific tanker was really accompanied with such a strong escort. Even if it did, I'm sure that the Russian Navy, if it was the Russian Navy, will not go for a direct confrontation with the US because A, it will lose, there's no doubt about that. Secondly, it will make what is essentially now a routine thing. It's not the first Russian or the so-called shadow fleet tanker that was captured to something completely different, to a level of direct military-to-military confrontation. I'm certain that neither the Russian commanders on the spot nor the Russian political leadership and military leadership in Moscow would have ordered any kind of action against the US forces. And actually British forces too, because it seems that the United Kingdom, that's the report that I've seen about an hour ago, lent a hand to the US during this operation.
Do you expect more reaction to come from Russia? Because obviously, even if there was no cargo, no oil on this tanker, it had some level of importance to both the Russians as well as to the Americans.
No, I don't think it will be any kind of super angry reaction. I think they will stay more or less with the statements by the Foreign Ministry, and the Ministry of Transport also issued a very, very timid statement. After what happened in Venezuela, after the capture of Maduro and a change of regime in Caracas, the Russians are afraid to voice any kind of emotion because they're afraid they will trigger Donald Trump into some kind of more drastic action. And I think that bearing in mind the difference in basically forces and capabilities, the Kremlin will be very cautious in the coming days and weeks.
I mean, we are seeing a change in the military posture of the United States when we look at what happened in Venezuela at the end of last week. Some are saying that this reflects a new foreign policy doctrine coming from Washington. Do you foresee Russia changing then its foreign policy, its international posture, to deal with what appears to be a more assertive, maybe more aggressive America?
Well, if you are asking me about whether Russia wants to do to, let's say, Ukraine or Armenia what the US did to Venezuela, the answer is absolutely yes. But can it? No, it cannot. As for the future, I think the Russians will be watching very closely what the US will be doing in spheres, in areas which directly touch upon Putin's biggest interest, and that is his aggression against Ukraine. If the US goes for more sanctions, if they start supplying Ukraine with more weapons, then it's going to be one thing. If the US says, well, essentially, we are only interested in oil, we are only interested in the Western Hemisphere, we're only interested in things that directly impact the US population, then probably Putin will try to basically raise the stakes in Ukraine. But frankly speaking, he never needed a pretext from the US to do it. The only question is whether he can.
Konstantin, let me ask you this. What do these events, what do they mean for the interpersonal connection between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump? I mean, Trump's critics have said time and time again that he seems to be too sympathetic to Putin and the agenda of the Kremlin. Has that been blown up?
Brock, you see, because Trump is Trump, because he changes every day, because he can be nice one day and angry next day, it is for Putin to adjust to Trump. One thing for sure, if you asked a few minutes ago about the reaction in the Russian blogosphere in the Russian media and the so-called Z bloggers, patriotic bloggers, to the tankers incident. Well, over the last few days, we've seen that these people were extremely cautious in discussing Venezuela because they don't know what's going to happen. And the Kremlin doesn't know what's going to happen. So they are all hedging their bets. So judge by yourself who is in the strong position here and who is not. I mean, maybe Trump will fall in love with Putin tomorrow. We don't know. I don't think so, though. What I think is important is that it's Putin who is a dependent side here. It's Putin who wants to keep relations with Washington on a certain level and not the US. So it is a very, very much a one-way street.
GW's Russia analyst Konstantin Eggert. As always, Konstantin, we appreciate your analysis. Thank you.
All right, well, let's break this down. And for that, we're speaking tonight with Stephen Blank, non-resident senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Research Institute's Eurasia programme. Great to have you on DW News. So let's start with the US seizure of the oil tanker in the North Atlantic. What's your take on the legality of this?
Well, the legality of this is moot. On the one hand, the ship is flying a Russian flag, and even though that Russian flag was implemented just a few days ago to prevent just such a contingency, once a ship is registered under a flag of any nation, it cannot be seized legally in the high waters. So that's the one hand. On the other hand, this was a Venezuelan ship. It originated as part of the shadow fleet delivering oil to Russia or bringing Russian oil back to Venezuela, whatever. And that allowed the UK to give the United States logistical support, as Minister Healy just said, and for the US to seize the ship based on the imposition of sanctions by the UK, the European Union, and the United States against the Russian shadow fleet. So the legality here is questionable, but it is not the same thing as the ship in the South Atlantic, which was seized, and which, frankly, represents just a part of the continuing illegality of the operation against Venezuela.
All right, before we move on to the other ship, of course, that was seized in the Caribbean, I want to speak first about the response from Russia, because they've responded angrily as the tanker was sailing under a Russian flag, as you mentioned there. What action can Moscow take here, though?
Well, Moscow could provide escorts to all the other shadow fleet vessels that are out there. It has threatened to do this and actually done it on a couple of occasions. It can threaten or make so-called hybrid war strikes against both the United States and its allies in Europe. But there's not a lot else that it can do unless it wants to escalate this, and I don't think they do. The reason we seized the ship now is precisely to prevent the Russian submarine that Moscow sent to escort it from getting there and escorting it. Because if we had tried to seize the ship then, that would have been a major escalation. It could have been a combat situation between U.S. and Russian forces, which obviously nobody is quite ready to accept yet.
Let's talk about this second tanker, the Sophia, which was seized in the Caribbean. Now, the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, said the Venezuelan leadership is cooperating with the United States. Are we seeing then some type of new relationship between Caracas and Washington developing here?
I'm not sure of that. I mean, Rubio can say that they are cooperating with the United States. I don't know that they have much of a choice in the matter. But the fact of the matter is that this is still an illegal operation, as was the actual invasion. Not because Maduro's a nice man, he isn't, but because of the fact that you can't go just into a country and seize the head of state because you don't like his policies. Second, it means a further involvement of the United States in Venezuelan affairs. And the fact is there is no strategic capability or rationale for the United States to run Venezuela, despite what President Trump said. And it's increasingly clear that the only reason we did this is to seize oil. And Venezuelan oil is in such bad shape that it doesn't make any sense economically. So what we have here is essentially an economic fantasy married to a fantasy of power and hemispheric dominance by the United States. I don't think this is going to end well. And while right now, if I can use a Stalinist phrase, the U.S. is dizzy from success, the further the United States gets involved in Venezuela, the more likely it is that this operation is going to blow up in our face.
I want to bring in just one final element tonight. Now, China has condemned the US for its action. How concerned are you of relations between Beijing and Washington worsening as a result?
Well, I think everybody should be. We have given China a pretext for doing the same kind of thing in Taiwan, although that would be a much more difficult operation, or in the South China Sea, or for that matter, territories which it disputes with Japan, the Senkaku Islands, for example. And we've given Russia the same kind of pretext for saying, well, Ukraine is part of our sphere of influence. And in Russia's case, they say Ukraine is Russia. So we have undermined the principles of international order. And to be honest, I don't see what we have gained other than psychological satisfaction.
Right, we're going to leave it there. Stephen Blank from the Foreign Policy Research Institute's Eurasia programme. Great to get your analysis tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.